Call this meeting to order, the 54th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance. Our orders today, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, our study of tax evasion and offshore bank accounts. This is our first meeting on this topic. To start this study off, we have two departments with us here today. I want to thank them for coming in this afternoon. We have three officials from the Canada Revenue Agency, and we have two officials from Finance Canada. Thank you for being with us here, ladies and gentlemen. I do have opening remarks for the Canada Revenue Agency. I believe Ms. Saraka will be presenting on behalf of CRA, and then Finance will be available for questions. Please begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to discuss the Canada Revenue Agency ongoing effort to combat aggressive tax planning, aggressive international tax planning, and tax evasion. My remarks will be in English and in French. So CRA is committed to protecting the integrity of the Canadian tax system by combating tax avoidance and tax evasions on all levels. Briefly, I would like to outline...
Interpreter is saying the sound system is not working. You want me to suspend? Sorry about this. Suspend? Okay, we'll suspend. Back to order. Just checking with translation. Ça va? Okay. Thank you. I apologize for that. Please begin your presentation again.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to discuss the Canada Revenue Agency ongoing effort to combat aggressive international tax planning and tax evasion. The CRA is committed to protecting the integrity of the Canadian tax system by combating tax avoidance and tax evasions on all levels. Briefly, I'd like to outline what we mean when we refer to tax avoidance and tax evasion. Tax avoidance involves minimizing tax by contravening the object and the spirit of the law, but not the letter of the law. It can lead to significant financial penalties and interest. Tax evasion involves a deliberate underreporting of tax payable, for example, by concealing income or assets and making false statements. Tax evasion is a crime. So in addition to being reassessed for taxes, interest and penalties, taxpayers who are convicted could spend time in jail and pay court-imposed fine of up to 100% of the tax they sought to evade. La clé de la stratégie nationale.
The key to the CRA's domestic and international strategy to prevent aggressive tax planning and tax evasion, in addition to active enforcement, is to make it easy for taxpayers to comply with their tax obligations, while ensuring that the consequences of avoiding or evading tax are serious. The problem of hiding income and assets in foreign jurisdictions is a serious one for many countries around the world, including Canada. When Canadians don't pay their taxes, they take resources away from health care, child care, employment insurance, pensions, and other programs. Companies that don't pay their taxes gain an unfair advantage over businesses that do. We expect taxpayers to operate in good faith. If they enter into financial transactions where the express purpose is to avoid or evade taxes, we take action.
The country combating international aggressive tax planning and tax evasion. These are global problems. So along with our partner in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Canada is a leader in setting and implementing internationally agreed upon tax standards. The G20 leaders, including Canada, announced an end to the era of banned secrecy in April 2009. They publicly committed to taking action against uncooperative jurisdictions, including tax havens. So Canada's close relationship with its international partners exemplify how countries can use information exchange to uncover information relating to aggressive international tax avoidance schemes and information to combat tax evasion. This close relationship is founded upon Canada's network of 87 tax treaties, one of the largest in the world, which allow us to exchange information with other countries. We are working hard to increase the flow of information by negotiating new tax information tax exchange agreements, include updating existing treaties and enhancing administrative arrangement with other countries. The CRA has increased the resources devoted to international tax issues. Since the last 5 years, the number of full-time employees working in the CRA aggressive tax planning has doubled, and the number of full-time employees working on international audit is up by 44%. We have staff centers of expertise across Canada with senior audit professionals and specialists in international tax and tax avoidance. Since 2006, we have audited more than 6,700 cases, identifying $3.5 billion in unpaid tax through our effort to combat aggressive international tax planning. In 2009 alone, we have uncovered $1 billion in unpaid tax involving international activities. The CRA also combats tax avoidance in the courts. The unnamed person requirement is a judicial authorization that allows the CRA to obtain information. We also use it for tax avoidance schemes that rely on bank secrecy in foreign jurisdiction to hide income or ownership and control of assets. Using unnamed requirement, we are able to require that a person or a company provide information regarding an unnamed third party. The CRA has used the unnamed requirement in many domestic and international cases. Education is also an important element of our strategy. We use community visits, speaking engagements, publications, our website to ensure that Canadians are aware of the consequences of evasion. L'Agence a communiqué avec succès son...
The CRA has been successful in communicating its message about the consequences of tax avoidance. It is an important contributor to the significant increase in the number of taxpayers coming forward with previously undisclosed assets through the Voluntary Disclosures Program, or VDP. When taxpayers come forward through the VDP and their disclosures meet the criteria requirements, they are still required to pay all taxes owing plus interest. The number of disclosures through the VDP program has steadily increased over the past 5 years. Last year, the agency received almost 3,000 international voluntary disclosures, resulting in $138 million in unpaid tax revenue, and the results so far this year show a continued increase. Identifying and addressing international aggressive tax planning and tax evasion is a significant undertaking for the CRA. It requires a long-term commitment to gathering intelligence, building international partnerships, and educating Canadians. Each year, the CRA increases its understanding of tax avoidance and evasion schemes, the institutions involved in them, and the best ways to bring them to an end. Canadians involved in tax avoidance or tax evasion should know that they will soon have no place left to hide their income or assets. So thank you again, Mr. Chair, for providing us this opportunity to discuss our ongoing efforts to combat international aggressive tax planning. We'll be pleased to answer any questions you might have. Thank you for your presentation. We will start with...
Does Finance have a short opening statement?
Raise your hand. I'd like to introduce myself and my colleague, if I might, and
sure,
we could
absolutely.
make a couple of moments remarks if the committee wishes to have us do so.
Okay, well, please do. Sorry, I thought you did not have one, but please.
Thank you. My name is Brian Ernowine. I'm the General Director in the Tax Policy Branch at the Department of Finance, and I'm joined by my colleague Alain Castonguay, who's the head of our Tax Treaty and Tax Information Exchange Agreement section at Finance. Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before the committee today to discuss the subject of offshore bank accounts held by Canadians, the actions being taken by Canada for combating international tax evasion, and Canada's involvement regarding the work of the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes. Since 1996, the OECD Project on Harmful Tax Practices, with Canada's participation, has identified a lack of transparency and of exchange of tax information as undermining the ability of tax administrations to enforce their tax laws and to combat international tax evasions. By way of context for this, a number of jurisdictions have maintained bank secrecy laws that made it an offense for any bank to share information about its clients with anyone, including foreign governments. Such laws can encourage Canadians to use banks in these jurisdictions either to hide money or to earn investment income that they don't intend to report in Canada. This, of course, is fundamentally unfair to the vast majority of Canadians who report all of their income and pay their taxes. In 2000, OECD and non-OECD countries, including Canada, formed a global forum on transparency and exchange of information to promote the OECD standards of transparency and effective exchange of tax information, what we refer to as the OECD standard. Essentiellement, the standard de l'OCDE dans le
Basically, the OECD standard promotes in the context of bilateral agreements 3 simple ideas. First, a country should exchange tax information with another country when such information is foreseeably relevant to the administration of the other country's taxation laws. Second, tax information exchange should not be subject to any domestic secrecy laws. And third, and this particularly applies in jurisdictions that impose no income tax, a country should exchange tax information notwithstanding that the country may not have any need for the information under its own domestic law.
implemented through the conclusion of tax treaties and tax information exchange agreements, or TIAs as we call them, which enable tax authorities to access information relevant to their tax matters in order to better enforce and administer their tax laws and to help prevent international tax evasion. The Global Forum drafted the text of a TIA that has since been used by most jurisdictions, including Canada, as a model to negotiate bilateral tax information exchange agreements. The turning point in the implementation of the OECD standard was the 2009 G20 summit in London. In April of 2009, the leaders of the G20 stated that they stood ready to take action and deploy sanctions to protect the public finances and financial systems of their countries against jurisdictions and tax havens that have either not committed to the OECD standard or failed to implement it. Since that time, the pace of negotiation of TIAs and of protocols to incorporate the OECD standard in tax treaties has increased dramatically. We've checked back, and as of April 2009, there were 65 TIAs and protocols that have been negotiated internationally. As of October of this year, that number is above 560. Now, what are we doing to combat international tax evasion here in Canada? In Budget 2007, the Government of Canada announced a policy that introduced incentives to have non-treaty countries enter into TIAs with Canada that include the OECD standard on tax information exchange. And the 2007 budget also stated as a government policy that all new treaties and revisions to existing treaties would also have to include the new standard for tax information exchange. To date, we've signed 11 TIAs, and we hope all of these will enter into force next year so that CRA can start to rely on them to obtain information from the jurisdictions they cover. We've also been involved in TIA negotiations with 14 other jurisdictions, and we hope to conclude negotiations and seek approval of these TIAs so they may be signed as soon as possible. Of Canada's 87 tax treaties in force currently, all but 7 of them meet the current OECD standard regarding exchange of tax information. Of those 7 that do not, we've recently signed a protocol with one of them, that is Switzerland, to bring the new standard into play, and have commenced negotiations or renegotiations with each of the other 6 to update the exchange of information provisions in those treaties so that they meet the OECD standard. Again, we hope to conclude negotiations and seek approval of those revised treaties as soon as they can be signed, and we hope that signature comes as soon as possible. Finally, there are other provisions in our income tax laws, either in force or currently proposed, which can be important tools in dealing with international tax avoidance. These include our foreign reporting rules, the taxation of investments in foreign investment entities, proposals to tighten our non-resident trust regime, and new reporting obligations in the last budget for those who participate in aggressive tax transactions. I won't review the details of any of those rules in my opening remarks, but perhaps there's an opportunity to discuss them during the questions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll begin with Mr. Szabo for 7 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to all the representatives for Finance and CRA. The statement that the number of full-time employees working on international audits is up by 44% since 2006. Pretty substantial, and I do recall some time ago that CRA audits related to anonymous phone calls or tips from the Canadian public were actually farmed out to accounting firms or to accountants or other investigators who could do a lot of the work. And the recovery rate was 1,700% return for every dollar spent by engaging outside persons, not full-time people. Are you aware of that? And why is it that we have to have the full-time people when there's so many so many people already engaged in the process internationally?
If I answer the question, if I understand your question, you're asking why do we hire full-time people? Well, I'm not certain I understand your question.
Well, that's right, you don't.
No.
But the CRA was farming out to agencies, to accounting firms, to people who had knowledge of it, who were in the business, to do the audits on a client basis. Here's somebody, go and have a look at it. And the return reported when I was on the Finance Committee last, back in the late 90s, was 1,700% return. It makes a lot of sense to me compared to having full-time employees. So maybe you would understand the question. You have these 44% increase in full-time employees. What return have you received on that increase in those number of employees then?
How you return in terms of how much tax revenue do they recover per person? That's your question.
Okay.
Is that your question? Okay, go ahead.
All right.
Well,
Why don't we try something else? I think you got.
I was going to attempt to answer the first part of your question, Mr. Chair. If I understand the question correctly, it seemed to infer that we were farming out to the outside public the audit workload that the CRA would undertake. And to my knowledge, we have never farmed out auditing activities to practitioners. The CRA audits. And
Yeah. The minister at the time was Jane Stewart, and she announced it in the House, and it was $1 billion recovery in the year that she during that year that she had she referred to. You can check back on that, but it was happening, and it makes a great deal of sense. With regard to the 1,700 accounts in the that came out in the I guess the Swiss and Liechtenstein issue. What is the approach that the government is using with regard to those accounts? How long is it going to take, and what kind of returns can be expected on pursuing those accounts?
I can try to answer that. The audit process for any of those audits is long. It's a long process just because of the nature of the type of audit we're doing. The first step is to do a risk analysis. So when we got information from Liechtenstein, we did risk analysis, and we narrowed down where the risk was, and we did some audits. So the numbers, if I'm not mistaken, we did 26 audits as of June 2010. I think as of October, we're up to 30 audits, and we're still doing some audits. But it is a long process simply because, as you can imagine, it's information from abroad, so it takes longer to get information from abroad. The information we get to is not complete. We don't have the social insurance number, the address, so we need to match this with our systems.
But you have, again, no idea how much money is spent to do this and what kind of return we could expect to get back from it.
We don't speculate on the amounts we can get.
Okay. On the voluntary disclosure program, when was the process developed, and when is the last time it has been reviewed in terms of how those are conducted?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The voluntary disclosure program originated in 1973. It's existed in the NAT form for a long time. We have made changes over the years to the program. As recently as this past year, we looked at to make sure our program continued to meet its objectives. As Madame Mikal pointed out in her opening statement, the numbers of voluntary disclosures continue to increase the last few years. Not only the disclosures, but the amount of money that the government collects through the voluntary disclosure program. It's a very successful program. Mm-hmm. We feel that the reason why the numbers have increased for VDP is as a result of the efforts of the government on the things like the tax exchange information agreements, the various other measures we've undertaken.
All right. Now, with regard to what point I want to get to before my time is the fact that people can do this on an anonymous basis, which isn't the same as if people are having their tax returns audited and have to sit there and provide the details and show their face. Brian Mulroney got a voluntary disclosure situation and landed up having to pay tax a lot less than any other Canadian probably would and has in the history when getting found to have not declared income. That's why I raised the process.
Okay.
Have you considered whether or not the situation of Mr. Mulroney should warrant a review of the process under the voluntary program?
Just a very brief response, please.
The voluntary disclosure program was reviewed this year, as I pointed out, and we feel that it's a very successful program. When someone comes to the CRA, they come on a no-name basis, but they do have to provide all the information needed. And once we agree to the voluntary disclosure, then the name of the person is then given to us, and then we undertake the examination of the file to ensure that the information we have is correct.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Monsieur Paet, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Paet, please. Yes, if you will, I'd like to follow up on that last question because there were some things in the opening remarks from the Canada Revenue Agency which were quite astounding. You read, and this is on page 8, I believe, or 6, however. You say that since 2006, 6,700 cases were audited, identifying approximately $3.5 billion in unpaid tax. If my calculations are correct, that's approximately $525,000 on average that you were able to recover, dividing 3.5 by 6,700. And Mr. Montroy, you've indicated that the VDP, the Voluntary Disclosure Program, is a success. And out of 3,000 disclosures, you were able to recover 138 million. And that's a 46,000. That's 11 times less than what's on the previous page. Now, so as for the VDP, I think taxpayers, are not asked to make a voluntary disclosure, and here you're boasting that this is incredible. You were able to recover on average $46,000 through the VDP, but in the same document you say that when this is broken down and when this represents $525,000, so 11.5 times more. So you have the voluntary disclosure. Okay. Jean Drapeau tried to impose a voluntary tax in order to pay for the Expo 67 and the Olympics. But it seems to me, in terms of taxation, we should not engage in voluntary processes. We should actually use more judicial measures. Well, you can't come up with the average in the same way. When you talk about the voluntary disclosure program, there's some cases of disclosure which weren't tied to unpaid taxes, but rather to dealing with amounts that were held offshore. So that's the 138 million in unpaid tax. So 138 million, that's in tax revenue. Yeah, in the voluntary disclosures, in the 3,000 for 2009, 2010, some of those disclosures are not cases where the taxpayer would have had to pay tax. There's also mandatory reporting of assets abroad, and when that form is not filed. I don't have the numbers with me exactly, but I'm surprised that people, it must be quite rare out of the cases of people who declare and they don't have tax to pay. Well, that doesn't necessarily represent an income rather than an asset. You also say in your opening remarks, because I was quite astounded by certain sentences. On page 2, you state that a new notice of assessment can be sent, and people and taxpayers that are recognized guilty could be jailed, could spend time in jail. And now there's a high level of public recognition to the fact that the wealthy don't pay taxes. They try to avoid the most possible. They receive fines, but they have the means to pay those fines. So that's like someone who can drive 200 miles an hour on the highway and say, that's no problem, I can pay for the ticket. So how does this work? When does the agency decide to prosecute? And are there litigation cases? Because this is of great interest. That is anyone prosecuted? Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a very good question. It's a question of civil rights versus criminal law. When we draw up notices of assessments in terms of income tax to be paid, it's based on a balance of probabilities. If the government wants to prosecute criminally, the agency has to be able to prove its case without reasonable doubt. I'm sure Mr. Mulcair will insist on that, but what I wanted to know is, how does this all work? What is the relationship between the Minister of Finance, who decides to tax people, the Department of Revenue, whose mandate is to collect, and when the money is not found, there's prosecution? When does the Department of Justice, or the Solicitor General, the Attorney General, get the green light to prosecute? Well, thank you. When we analyze the evidence, our work is to try to build the best evidence possible. At one point in time, we consult with our colleagues from the Department of Justice to make sure that we have the necessary evidence to build a case and to prosecute criminally. And it is only following discussions with the Department of Justice, and I forget exactly, with the Public Prosecution's Office, it is with them that we decide whether we have enough evidence to prosecute. I have a question that's related. We know that in France in 2009, announcements were made to the effect that some banks had to shut down their tax havens, or the branches they had in tax havens. Canada in 2009, in annual reports from the 5 major chartered banks, there were 79 branches in tax havens declared. And recently, because of the initiative in France, BNP Paribas announced that it would be selling to Scotiabank in Canada its activities in Panama, the Grand Caymans, and in Bahamas. When will Canada do the same thing? That is, to require that branches in tax havens be shut down, rather than simply buying those branches in tax havens? Thank you. An answer, please.
Simplement dit, ce n'est pas notre proposition.
I'd like to simply say that that wasn't our proposal.
I've already described, to deal with the issue of tax evasion through more transparency, specifically through exchange of information agreements that allow Canada to collect information, that allows CRA to conduct its audit and enforce its taxes. It's not proposed to impose sanctions such as those imposed by France, or at least that has not been part of the objective to date. The objective has been trying to get transparency in place, so that isn't an issue.
Okay, thank you. Merci. Monsieur Généreux, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Généreux, please, you have 7 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I would like to welcome our witnesses to the committee. I, too, am a bit interested by comments that you've written in your brief, Ms. Ricard. I'd like to come back to page 2, where you make a distinction between tax avoidance and tax evasion. I would like, for the benefit of the Canadians who are watching us, because these debates are being televised, I want to make sure I understand the distinction in terms of the law. Because in your opening remarks you say, in terms, but not the letter of the law. What do you mean by the letter of the law in making that distinction between the two? Well, the distinction between tax evasion and tax avoidance, one is it uses the principles in the Act but in such a way that does not meet the intention of the Act. That's why in 1988 the Department of Finance gave us the authority to combat tax avoidance in order to find certain transactions that don't necessarily respect the principle of the Act. So you're analyzing people's good faith in order to make the distinction. Well, yes, we look at people's good faith, but we also consider documents and transactions that are made. As to a tax evasion, there's a clear intent to commit fraud. Actions were taken to ensure they get the results that they've obtained. So you analyze cases, and you talk about 6,700 cases since 2006. What I find interesting is that our government has implemented the mechanisms to increase the number of cases. Has the number of cases increased dramatically in the past few years? Because additional amounts have been allocated to that program. In 2005-2006, for instance, there were 278 cases. In 2009-2010, 1,251. So that's a substantial increase. Is that because additional amounts were allocated to the audit functions? Yes. In part, that is attributable to the fact that with the amounts that we received, we were able to extend the coverage with regard to transfers and aggressive tax planning, and therefore we were able to increase our number of audits. We've also, with the amounts received, implemented centers of expertise, which are analyses centers which help us to build up intelligence. So that means that with regard to the current legislation, the amounts that you've received have allowed you to recover money. Yes, all this goes to the consolidated revenue. We receive our funding, and everything we receive goes into the consolidated revenue fund. We received additional funding over the years, which has allowed us to increase our resources in terms of audits and research. On page 6 in your opening remarks, you say, and I'll read the paragraph, the CRA also combats tax avoidance in the courts. The unnamed persons requirement is a judicial authorization that allows the CRA to obtain information. So how does that work exactly? Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. The unnamed persons requirement is a mechanism in the Income Tax Act that allows us to obtain information from individuals or third parties. And this is a way to recover money from taxpayers who perhaps have assets or information abroad. For instance, the classic example would be a third-party request that we carry out an audit on a financial investigation, or that a corporation gives us the name and the accounts of individuals, and it's with such information that we carry out research and we open files for audits. So therefore, can we say that that approach is productive in terms of catching people who want to avoid paying taxes? I imagine you can recover substantial amounts. Yes, certainly, Mr. Chair. In the past few years, this has been a mechanism that we've been using increasingly to obtain information from financial institutions. And I'd even go as far as to say that financial institutions have been of great assistance, have given us the information we've requested, and it was such information that we were able to undertake a number of audits. And it's one of the reasons why the number of audits and the amounts that have been recovered have increased over the past few years. Is there a link between that and last year, if I'm not mistaken, in January, Minister Blackburn had access to a list of clients or Swiss bank accounts. Is there a link between that, or am I not talking about the same thing? Those are two different things. However, If I might add something with regard to the unnamed persons requirement, that allows us to better understand the various tax schemes, who's involved, and it allows us to obtain additional information and to build intelligence on the stakeholders and those who promote such schemes. As for the list that Mr. Blackburn had access to, well, that's with regard to the exchanges we have with our international partners. That was as part of the treaty we have with France. And as part of that treaty, will there be consequences for people whose names were on that list? We've obtained the names and we will undertake audits. Do you have an average amount of time that's spent on those audits? Are we talking about a number of years to carry out those audits? Well, perhaps briefly put, what we do with the information that we obtain is we conduct a risk assessment, we look at the information in our system, and the first challenge is to make sure that we have properly identified the right individuals, including the address and the social insurance number. And then we contact the taxpayer, we send them a questionnaire, for instance, and then often we don't get much cooperation from individuals, which means that we might need our mechanisms. So that takes a lot of time, especially since the information is abroad. Thank you. Mr. Mulcair, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll let you respond to the few questions I have. Do you have any idea of the global amount in unpaid taxes between what was supposed to be paid and what is being stashed abroad? The Americans have talked about an amount of $100 billion US. What's the estimate in Canada? We've never tried to estimate that amount. It could be very difficult to do. It could require a lot of resources. What we're doing is looking for unpaid taxes and assets that are undeclared. And yet the U.S., Mexico, Sweden, the U.K. do publish an estimate of those unpaid taxes. How come they do and you can't? I don't have an indication to the effect that our U.S. colleagues have published a list. Yes, they've said it was $100 billion in unpaid taxes. Well, I've read in the literature that there are a number of organizations that have published estimates in the U.S. The estimate that I'm talking about has been published by the U.S. Treasury Department. These are not individuals, not NGOs, not lobbyists. It's the U.S. Treasury Department.
It's possible to create estimates using assumptions, but by its very nature, the amount of tax evaded is a very difficult thing to determine. It's by definition that which you do not know, and so one could make assumptions, as I've said, to estimate what some call this tax gap.
Let's make an assumption together. Let's make an assumption together about our tax gap. If the Americans are estimating theirs at $100 billion, is it reasonable to assume that ours could be in the $10 billion range? Again,
we can run arithmetic together, Mr. Chairman, but it would be all based on assumptions, and so if you wanted to say 10% of what the Americans said...
Why can the U.S. Treasury make that estimate and you can't? I just don't understand.
Frankly, I'm not familiar with the U.S. estimate or that it's a Treasury estimate or how it's framed or constructed.
In 2009, Barbados, Bermuda, and the Cayman Islands received direct investment from Canada to the tune of $78.4 billion. That's $13 billion more than our total direct investment in the UK, which is our second largest trading partner after the US. Could you tell us if that has not raised an alarm as to whether there was a major case of tax avoidance?
Necessarily points to that at all. I think there's a large amount, of investment made by Canadian multinationals in a number of jurisdictions, including Barbados and Bermuda and others, and that's reflected by the investment of other countries as well. These places are important destinations for investment. Bermuda is a noted insurance locale. Barbados has been a long-standing treaty partner with Canada, and a large volume of investment is through it as well.
Bien. Monsieur le Président.
Very well. Mr. Chair, the OECD has calculated that the total amount held in shady jurisdictions would be around 5 to 7 trillion, and whereas the Tax Justice Network in the UK believes it's a bit higher, but in the same order of magnitude, approximately $11 trillion. Do those figures appear credible? Well, we have not tried to estimate the amount of money, but what I could tell you, we've received additional funding which has allowed us to increase our audit capacity. And with our foreign colleagues, either bilaterally or multilaterally, we've been able to understand better the various tax schemes. UCAM has produced a report. It is calculated that between 1992 and 2007, the 5 Canadian charter banks have been able to avoid $16 billion in federal and provincial tax. Would you challenge those figures? I'm not aware of that study. You're not aware of the UCAM study? You have no estimate, and the only pertinent study is a study you don't know of? I'm quite astounded by that. I'm not aware of the study either, but what I can tell you is that the OECD has addressed the issue of financial institutions and aggressive tax planning, and so we're aware of those schemes. In 2007, thanks to someone who disclosed the UBS list, the Americans were able to fine UBS to the tune of $750 million, and hundreds of Canadians were on the UBS list, and you've confirmed that earlier. How much money was recovered so far from that list out of UBS? The VDP program has allowed us to recover a substantial amount in unpaid taxes. We're looking at the lists that have been obtained through the Unnamed Persons Requirement program. I'd like to rephrase the question. Are audits or investigations carried out on Canadian banking operations abroad? Yes, it's part of these are part of our major cases. How come then, if audits are carried out regularly, it's only when the Americans receive a list from UBS or the French receive a HSB list that how come we don't receive any information aside from those moments?
Here for a moment. I think the honourable member is conflating two different points. One is the legitimate concern, and that's which we've been trying to address, of those who would seek to hide income in foreign financial institutions. The other is the taxation of investments of Canadian financial institutions themselves abroad. We are familiar with the study to which you referred, and the calculations that were made essentially seem to be based on taking the amount of income that Canadian banks have earned abroad over a number of years, multiplying that by a Canadian tax rate to come up with an estimate of taxes that, in the views of the author of the study, have been avoided. That is not, in our view, a valid analysis of taxes sought to be avoided.
We'll have to come back to this in another round. Mr. Pichetti, please, for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for coming forward. I think there's two purposes why we're here. First, we're trying to understand what the magnitude is of whether you want to call it tax evasion for offshore bank accounts, but basically tax evasion is tax evasion. The way I see it, there's basically two types of tax evasions, domestically and internationally. And I can't believe that there is no estimate. So I guess our first prerogative would be, our first priority would be to determine how much the amount would be, and then after that would be what kind of tools can we provide you with so that you can go after that money. I think it's a very basic philosophy of what we're trying to do here. And I can't believe that we don't have numbers. I mean, we do see different numbers, whether it be OECD, independent professors making estimates. And my question was going to be, how are these calculated? Internally, there must be an amount that you calculate. I'm sure the Minister of Finance does it. The Department of Finance does it for the CRA. And so my question would be, how do you calculate tax evasion, whether it be domestically and internationally? I understand it's not going to be a hard number, because if you actually had the hard number, then you'd actually have the dollar amounts in your bank account, correct?
Well, again, I'm sorry, but we don't know what we don't know, and you can make assumptions about some of this stuff, and that will certainly produce a number.
Okay, so then let me stop you there. So then how do we, when you have the voluntary disclosure program, when you start seeing people actually voluntarily disclosing, is there not a trend? Do you see it more in times when times are tough, when there's economic booms, or when the U.S. is going after some of the offshore bank accounts? There must be a trend. There's other countries, what they have done is they've decided to give amnesty. So they've said, bring in your money and we'll charge you either 5, 10, 15, 20. There must have been some analysis done where that could be an option, where you just say, listen, bring in your money and we'll tax you at a flat rate.
Well, I guess I would say, and my colleagues from CRA may have other comments, but I would say that we believe that reducing the opportunities to evade tax will reduce tax evasion, and so that's what we're doing as a policy shop at Finance, is trying to put forward, as you call it, those tools to allow CRA better access to information and therefore to reduce tax evasion. And I think with that, in tax, it's the same as, I don't know, for example, an extradition treaty, where if you've got an extradition treaty with another country, then that takes one country off the list that a fugitive might move to. If you take a jurisdiction off the list of somebody that has bank secrecy laws protecting them from us getting access to their investments there, then that's one less place for them to go to seek to evade taxes.
So, but every time we sign a tax information exchange agreement, I think that's the term, do we see more voluntary disclosures? Do we see more money coming in? Should we be moving faster?
That's a fair question. I would say that at this stage that remains unanswered, because the tax information exchange agreements we've signed have not yet themselves been brought into force. One of them was tabled earlier this year, or perhaps even late last year. 10 more were tabled within the past few days, I guess, to be.
Because I'm not so sure that's the answer. Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry.
Because I know that we've had exchange of information with other countries, even with, countries like the United States. Not all amounts between borders get declared. So I can just imagine how long it's going to take before we get proper information from countries like Bermuda, Cayman Islands, or Dominica, or also not because I'm trying to pick on these islands, but some of them. The record keeping is less to be desired, and when we have trouble tracking money coming in from the States, I think it's going to go a long way before we catch any of the people from these exchange of information countries.
May I just make a comment about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, yes, the U.S. obviously is, perhaps not obviously, but it is the case that we have a very good exchange of information procedure with the U.S. In many cases, the information with the U.S. is exchanged automatically. My colleagues again can speak to that, but it's very advanced, if you will. The second point is in relation to the new jurisdictions, if you want to call it, that are coming on and agreeing to exchange of information, perhaps for the first time with us and other countries. Yes, there is a concern that they, to be blunt about it, may not be committed to doing that, or may not have the capacity to actually deliver on exchange of information when asked to do so. And that's part of what the work of the Global Forum is a two-stage analysis that's underway now. It'll first of all go through and review every jurisdiction, including Canada's, legal architecture, whether it's got the laws in place and the agreements in place to exchange information. Then the second phase, taking place for some now and others in the next year or two, will actually be to analyze and assess their on-the-ground performance with respect to the exchange of information to make sure that everybody who's committed to exchange of information is actually delivering on exchange of information.
Okay, thank you. We'll go Monsieur Carré, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I find the figures that you've put forward, Ms. Ricard, quite astounding. On page 6, I come back to this when you say that in 2009 alone, the CRA discovered $1 billion in unpaid tax through international activities. I find it quite astounding to learn that. Now, taxpayers who are now listening to our debates here would find that it doesn't burnish the government's reputation all that much. Of course, these people can be caught, but if we recovered $1 billion, that means that there's a whole lot more money that's still out there. So what are the shortcomings? Do you make shortcomings with the government in order to remedy the situation? Because, in my view, I find this is to be quite it's not normal. I mean, you discover $1 billion in 1 year alone. When you think of the difficulties that regular taxpayers can have with the CRA, I think there's a lot of money that's in play. Do you have a recommendation to make? Because in your opening remarks, at least in the first 2 pages, everything seems to be running smoothly. But with the figures that you mention later on, well, I find the situation to be quite dramatic. I'd like to get an idea of the recommendations you like to make to the government to improve the situation. Well, it's thanks to a greater number of auditors, and our processes are more sophisticated. We also work with international partners who face the same problems as we do. International aggressive tax planning has started to catch our attention a few years ago. And we started to work in partnership with other countries. One example I could give you is that a few years back, I don't recall exactly when, but we created the working group on tax havens, and Canada was a founding member and a leader of that working group. And that was to learn from the schemes that are discovered around the world and to prosecute and identify those people. In 2004, along with other countries, we created the Joint International Tax Shelter. There's an office in Washington and in London in the UK. There are 6 countries in that working group, and we have a representative in Washington. And I'm talking about exchange of information that is being carried out daily. So our processes are more sophisticated, and we're able to detect people engaged in that aggressive tax planning. I want to make sure I understand correctly. In the cases that you audit, are we talking about, in some cases, income that's generated by Canadian corporations and that on which tax is not being paid, and all of a sudden that income is found in an offshore account? Are we talking about a shortcoming here in the audit process in Canada before having to rely on other countries and obtaining information from them? Well, I'll try to respond. What you're talking about is tax avoidance. We live in a global economy, and yes, there might be corporations that transfer income to jurisdictions where the tax rates are lower or where certain practices are allowed. But up to now, the recoveries that we've made allow us to better understand the tax schemes involved, and thanks to that information we can make recommendations to the Department of Finance to make changes to the legislation, and that way we'll increase compliance. You have 30 seconds left. In the 2,000 or so cases that were disclosed through the UBS list in Switzerland, you indicated that the audit process had not really gotten underway. If that is the case, I can tell you that I'm surprised to learn that. I'm surprised you're not making that a priority case, and that audits should be carried out on a priority basis. One clarification, yes, audits have been undertaken, but the list was received not too long ago, so we're still analyzing the information that we've received in order to see what the information we have, and so all of this is quite recent. I believe we received the information in the spring of 2010. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our guests for coming today and providing the information in this area, and well, like many areas, but numbers can be thrown around and put in the public, and let's be frank, the public doesn't have a great understanding, and neither do I until I started looking at the issue of what actually is happening, and I think that's only fair. And for example, we had a comment about recoveries, and that could have been about collections and not about audits of international activity that are happening. It could have been, so I don't know what happened 15, 20 years ago when that minister was there, but I'm guessing it was about collections. But just give me some examples of what, based on what you've responded to other members, we don't waste a lot of time, or your organization has not wasted a lot of time trying to come up with a guesstimate number on what the outstanding numbers might be. You're actually going after those who are either avoiding taxes, which is not a criminal offense, but it's there's penalties and so on, and we need to get that money back, or those who are purposely not paying taxes, and that is a criminal offense. And you're spending based on the answers you've given here today, you're actually actively pursuing those avenues. Based on the numbers you've told me, back in 2005, 2006, it looks like there was about 278 cases, about $175 million recovered, or paid back, or whatever. By this time last year, we're about 1,250 cases, or 1,250 cases, and about $1 billion. Is that because you have more resources? Have we been spending more money in this particular area with more people doing it? Is that what is generating that tremendous increase in recoveries?
This is correct.
And how long has that process been in place? Like, does that take a year, 2 years, 3 years? Are there people available to hire to do that, do that work? So how long have we been at this improvement?
Well, I'll answer the question. I think I understand, but we received funding several years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and with that, we've increased the coverage of transfer pricing, of aggressive tax planning, and the way we operate is we have tax services office who do the work, so that means more employees to do some audits, and that's what resulted in better results.
So one of our opposition parties in the House have been standing up and saying things like, we've reduced our activity in this area by 16%, in terms of the government slashed the enforcement budget by 16%. Is that an accurate statement, or do you have any idea where they would find that number from?
We have received additional funding for international, for example, twice, 2006 and 2007. So we have increased our, as I said, the international audit program by 44%, from 300 employees to close to 440, and the aggressive tax planning from 244 to 500 employees. Just they're not the only one involved in these things, but so they have doubled in the aggressive tax planning. And of course, in relation to that additional funding, you need funding
Right.
for our lawyers to help us go to court, the additional.
There have been also statements made that this government is turning a blind eye to tax evasion and that we're changing the rules to make it, us to being less aggressive on tax evasion and so on. Is that true? Like, has that happened in your department? Is there anything changes that has happened? I'm asking them and not you. Thank you.
Well, as the number speaks for themselves, we have increased our capacity, our knowledge, our expertise, sophistication, and we're going after that. And we have, I can tell you that we have very passionate employees working on that, because it takes a lot of patience, a lot of rigor, and a lot of knowledge. And they have to continually study and learn new.
Well, keep up the good work, and thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Bryson, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I want to commend Mr. Wallace for, as a conservative, for his strong support of the public service. And it's good to see from. It's good. No, I was a progressive conservative. There was a big difference. But in any case, the question on the relationship between those who would evade paying their taxes in Canada and potential proceeds from organized crime. How closely are you working with other agencies, other enforcement and investigative agencies, including the RCMP white-collar crime unit? Are you working closely with them on some of these issues, with the assumption being that some of those who would want to hide proceeds of crime might do so through offshore accounts?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, indeed, we do work extensively with law enforcement agencies. FINTRAC has a system in place where they would send information to the CRA in cases of that they've noted that there's possible tax evasion. We also work closely with our colleagues in finance to get amendments that we need. In the last budget, tax evasion was considered a predicate offense. The various pieces of legislation were changed to ensure that in cases when we did go to court and we prove tax evasion, that the proceeds of crime and money laundering provisions would apply to allow us to go after the assets and the money of those convicted of tax evasion.
How strong is the linkage between offshore accounts and organized crime?
I would say is that the tax administrator is very difficult for us to answer a question like that. My colleagues in FINTRAC and the RCMP would perhaps be in a better position to answer that.
We have, in fact, in Canada, some of the Canadian banks have very effective private wealth management arms, whether it's Harris Bank with BMO. In fact, all of the chartered banks have very strong wealth management groups. Would you say that a Credit Suisse, as an example, or a UBS, do you see any difference between the services that Credit Suisse might provide and a Harris private bank might provide? Do you see any potential product differentiation?
Well, I'd like to be able to say as a public servant, I never have any dealings with Credit Suisse or those type of institutions. So I personally cannot comment about what the services they provide. I'm not aware of them.
Well, I'm a public servant in a sense too, so I share your pain. But My point is, does it strike you as, given the strength of our Canadian banks and given the efficacy of our Canadian banks' private wealth management arms, doesn't it strike you that there is one key difference in terms of what they can offer their clients and what, say, a Credit Suisse or a UBS might be able to offer?
I don't think we can answer that question. We don't.
Yeah, Sure. May I make a suggestion? I'm not trying to tell you how to do your jobs, but I would think that if I were you, I'd be assuming that those banks, one of what a Swiss bank would offer over a Canadian bank would be relative ease of hiding money in a Swiss account. And to me, would there not be a disproportionate level of participation in offshore accounts amongst Canadians who are clients of Credit Suisse or UBS? Or have you investigated that?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bryson. Ms. Ricardo?
There are not that many of these kind of institutions in Canada. When I say I'm afraid I cannot answer that question.
To follow those leads.
Thank you for the suggestions.
Just trying to help. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bryson. Mr. Menzies, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. This is a very enlightening discussion for a lot of us. I think we've all heard about some of these issues that are going on and are all rather offended by the fact that the honest Canadians pay their taxes. Not that anybody likes paying their taxes, but the honest Canadians do. And so I applaud your work in trying to follow those that don't. Following up on some of these agreements then, our Prime Minister, I believe it was in October, signed an agreement with my friend Madame Letard in Switzerland. Is that the type of agreement that the OECD is encouraging? Perhaps, Mr. Ernewine, you could reflect on that one if you would.
The short answer is yes, it is. We have a comprehensive double tax agreement or tax treaty with Switzerland already, but the terms of it in relation to exchange of information were not as comprehensive as we have sought in what I've described earlier as this OECD standard. And the Swiss agreed in a protocol to the treaty signed in October to adopt the new OECD standard that covers all the ground. And so that is essentially on all fours with the tax information exchange agreements we're signing with other jurisdictions that don't include a comprehensive DTA or double tax agreement.
I guess if I can follow up on that, when I was had a meeting at the OECD, we spent one day in Berlin at the request of the finance minister. I think that was in 2009, where some countries, I believe 3 or 4 countries, were quite upset that they actually had been, and to use the term, named and shamed, because they weren't living up to the standards, the OECD standards. And we were actually expecting a very, very difficult meeting when, in fact, they basically came and said in front of all the other countries that they would be acceding to those standards. We haven't used the term name and shame here talking about these countries. Does it work, or was that one instance maybe?
Well, I think that some of the countries felt it a bit undiplomatic when others were pressing them to agree to things such as this on greater exchange of information. There were from time to time many assertions of each country's own sovereignty and objections about being pushed or pressured into making these changes. Be that as it may, the result we were all seeking we thought was the right one, and yes, there were a number of countries that were hesitant to get there. As I said, I think the watershed was the G20 of 2009, right, where in the midst of the financial crisis, a number of countries were essentially saying enough is enough and demanding cooperation, and indeed it was forthcoming. And as I've also given the stat about the about the number of tax information exchange agreements that have been signed since that time. So we think we're on the side of right in this case, and so while I don't want to roll out the end justifies the means, we think that it's all for the good what has happened.
Right. Okay. And you did say 14 of these TIAs are under negotiation now?
Yeah.
That still doesn't total a lot of countries in my mind. I just wonder, are they slow coming forward?
Well, there were...
or is that all we need?
There's 25 TIAs in total, 11 that have been signed and 14 more under negotiation. So that's that total. That combined with our treaty network, which is fairly extensive with 87 treaties and a couple of more to be ratified, means that we've got 120 some, 110 or 115 jurisdictions or countries covered. That represents a lot of the industrialized world. It's certainly the case that our treaties and TIAs do not cover every last country and jurisdiction, but through the OECD work, the countries that were thought to merit the most attention have been identified, and those countries thought to merit the most attention have been pursued by us and other countries to get TIAs in place.
Some of the small jurisdictions that we don't ordinarily pay a lot of attention to, like Guernsey, how do they manage to attract money that skips out of this country?
Well, I think their proximity to the UK is important, and to Europe as well. It is true that, speaking personally, there's a number. I've learned a little bit of geography as a result of this, and some of the smaller islands in the South Pacific that are new to me. No, you don't have to have a vast land mass to have sovereignty and to be able to offer certain regulatory or tax advantages, and so there are some small jurisdictions that have seen that as an advantage to do that. It's raised concerns for us, and so we're trying to find that balance.
Good. Thank you.
Dabo again, please.
It's often been said that if everybody paid their fair share, we would all pay less. I'm pretty sure that's true. And therefore, it's probably a priority for Canadians to see that we are being rigorous with all the tools that are available to us domestically as well as internationally, and that the efforts that we're making are in fact generating returns or a payback which is well in excess of what we put into it, because costing out a particular case usually indicates that there's an awful lot more ancillary or extended costs like legal, etc. So having put that way, we're really talking about the underground economy and the fact that it's been estimated at the tens of billions of dollars, which should be of concern and of interest to us. So the question is I think for finance, whether or not we have had a serious discussion in finance about our strategy for addressing the underground economy. When's the last time we looked at it, did a paper, engaged Canadians, and found out just how far are Canadians prepared to go while protecting personal privacy, etc., but to ensure that we find as many people as possible who are not paying their fair share?
That's a fair question, and it's certainly the case that we do want to be attentive to the system we've got in place to I think, essentially help CRA in its ability to enforce Canada's laws. Now, primarily, or first and foremost, I'd say Canada's got a self-assessment system. For the most part, Canadians, honest Canadians, declare their income and pay their taxes. For those that don't, writing more rules don't necessarily help in terms of tax evasion. If you write another law saying you really owe the tax, that doesn't necessarily advance matters. For that group that seek to evade tax, it's necessary to put in other rules that sort of come about it a different way or give revenue more information, which allows them to try to identify these taxpayers and make sure their taxes due. Now, in the context of sort of international tax, which is the focus, I think, of today's discussion, I identified in my opening remarks a few different things. We have had for a number of years foreign reporting rules, which aren't income tax or rules requiring a declaration of income, they're requiring a declaration of the existence of foreign assets as another way of trying to get at this thing. We've had rules for some time that deal with the taxation of investments in so-called foreign investment entities.
Okay. My time is running out, so just two other quick questions. The first one has to do with, I think we've got international trade agreements with about 90 different countries. Why don't we make it a precondition of a trade deal to also enter into an information sharing agreement on taxation? Isn't that a good partner to have?
Perhaps. I don't have a ready answer for it. I will make the observation that I think there's probably a lot of overlap in the criteria that we'd apply in terms of having both. Lots of economic interaction, diplomatic relations as a threshold question.
It's just a thought. If they're a good trading partner, if it's a partnership worth having, then we should be working together in our best interest. Finally, let me deal with all of these internet service providers, not providers, but businesses, internet businesses, who send into Canada these millions and millions of messages to everybody about your TD account has a problem, it's been shut down, contact us immediately to fix it. And it's got the logo on it, same with Scotia, same with RBC, same with every one of our national banks. These are all outside the reach of Canadian law. But there's no question in my mind that they are defrauding a lot of Canadians. And that's just as bad. That's just as bad as the tax evasion and illegal avoidance. So I guess the question is, how does that work into your consideration of international dealings when many of these countries, like in India, China, etc., are hotbeds for these massive telephone banks and internet banks, which are bombarding Canadians with attempts to defraud Canadians?
Brief response.
Brief response is that I certainly appreciate the concern. I don't think there's a direct linkage between that and the exchange of tax information. Indeed, we're pretty concerned about tax information being provided to other countries only for the sake of making assessments of tax in that other country and vice versa. So its use for other purposes would be something that would have to be sort of given due deliberation, if I may.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Block, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us here today. Ms. Ricard, in your opening statement, you stated that the key to the CRA's domestic and international strategy to prevent aggressive tax planning and tax evasion is to make it easy for taxpayers to comply with their tax obligations while ensuring that the consequences of avoiding or evading tax are serious. You also stated that we expect taxpayers to operate in good faith and that if they enter into financial transactions for the express purpose of avoiding or evading taxes, you take action. In another statement, you talked about the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion, and that tax avoidance is about contravening the object and spirit of Canada's tax laws, and I'm assuming that evasion would be that you actually contravene the letter of the law. And I'm wondering if you can explain, once it has been determined that the letter of the law has been contravened and an investigation needs to take place, what triggers that? And then I want to ask some questions about tax evasion convictions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier today, we did talk about, I attempted to sort of explain the difference between what I'll call the civil side versus criminal side, and it's basically a burden of proof. So when we raise tax assessments based on tax avoidance, it's simply a question of preponderance of evidence. Whereas when we go the criminal route, tax evasion, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. And so it's essentially the level of documentation and proof that we need to have in consultation with our colleagues in justice to be able to prosecute a case of tax evasion.
Okay. So can you explain for me the process of a tax evasion conviction and how long that would take?
Well, as a lawyer, I would tell you that the simple answer is it takes a long time. Any sort of criminal case, there's different reasons why it takes time. We have an approach in the agency where we like to obviously publicize our successes in criminal cases. So as a result, we put a lot of work into our efforts to make sure that our files, so to speak, are as solid as possible to ensure when we do go to court on a tax evasion case that we're successful. And I believe our numbers show that in upwards of 90% of cases where we file for tax evasion charges that we're successful. And so it's as a result of the good work that goes on beforehand. And so it takes a long time to prepare a case to make sure it goes to court. And even when it does go to court, obviously the taxpayers that we're going after are doing everything in their power to delay the process. And so it simply takes a long time.
Okay. So the process is long and the files are complex. But the number of tax avoidance audits is increasing, as well as an increased use of named and unnamed requirements. Do you anticipate the rate of convictions will increase due to the results of the work that you've done over the past 4 years?
Well, I would say in a perfect world, there would be less tax evasion. And so it's a combination of many, many things. My colleague from the Department of Finance talked about the tax exchange of information agreements that will enable us to get information from various countries to enable us to raise assessments. And although the TIAs are not in place yet, the fear of the CRA having access to that information we've already seen people coming forward to correct their tax matters. So if it's a difficult question to answer, will we see an increase? It is possible in the sense that if people continue to try to avoid paying taxes, despite the fact that our tools have increased with the TIAs and exchange of information agreements, we're confident that we will be able to get more and more information in years to come to build more cases.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Mulcair.
Mr. Mulcair, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Irnwine, first of all, I suggest that you come back with Léopold Laison and the team from the University of Quebec in Montreal, because your colleagues from the other place did not have the time to consider his study. You had a response which was quite telling as to the non-validity of his study. So I'd like to receive from you something that's quite comprehensive to support your argument, because the UQAM study appeared to be quite valid to me. So I would offer to invite you here quite informally and later perhaps more formally.
Of a few different cases and just try to get an answer from the people at Revenue where things are. Une enquête par la France d'une filiale.
Investigation by France into an HSBC branch discovered over $1 billion in assets hidden by Canadians in Switzerland. Have you investigated that, and where is the investigation at? You say you studied that since the springtime and you don't have anything to report? Okay, very well. As well, RBC Dominion Securities. And we have an affidavit from an investigator from your...
Structures involving Liechtenstein entity account holders and offshore accounts, allowing them to masquerade as non-residents, hiding their investments and other income from the CRA, and neglecting their obligations to pay Canadian tax. Ça se retrouve dans le Globe and Mail et CBC.
I was seen in the Globe and Mail and the CBC. So where are we at with that case in Liechtenstein? As for Liechtenstein, no, that wasn't HSBC. We've made 26 audits in the spring, and as of October, 13 audits have been carried out. We're continuing our work in that regard, and we've got good results with $5.8 million. According to the Globe and Mail in January 2010, your agency was also trying to obtain results with Scotiabank with regard to a trust fund that it has for a number of wealthy clients, including $900 million from 6 wealthy families. There's also Scotiabank's Irish branch, which funds manages a trust fund, and apparently cannot obtain information from its own branch. We're talking about a Canadian branch, 100% owned by a Canadian bank. They have that information, but they cannot receive the information from our own branch in Ireland. So where is the investigation at now? Section 241 prevents us from speaking of specific cases. Well, if at least, are you able to tell us in other cases whether you're pursuing your actions, or this is of public interest, and that's why we're talking about this today? That's a bit too specific, actually, because it concerns a bank. It concerns wealthy families, because you talked about other cases earlier. Well, we talked about a list earlier. We didn't talk about specific situations. I didn't ask you to identify the 6 wealthy families.
That are that specific.
Oh, zut. On aurait tellement voulu.
Gee, we really would have liked to obtain more information, Mr. Chair. Now, let's talk about your assessment of your return on the investment in terms of the expertise that you've developed. You indicated that the agency has dedicated staff. Has a calculation been done in terms of how much is invested in terms of enforcement and how much money will be recovered? Do you have an analysis of the amounts that are recovered and in terms of the amounts that are invested in terms of enforcement? 30 seconds. Well, yes, we have to make that type of analysis as to how much money we can recover. However, that's not an objective per se. You don't have any figures to say if we invest more in enforcement, we'll recover more taxes. Well, it all depends on the costing that we do. We have to look at past experience to see the results obtained in various sectors. Thank you. So, Mr. Ernwine, the team from the UQAM will be pleased to talk to you about that study.
Point. I will say that the committee has considered that question before, and I'm happy to attend again. I'm happy to offer a couple of observations today if the committee is interested on to explain what I thought was the concern with that, but just to make note of the fact that I think it has been considered by the committee previously.
Okay. Thank you.
Pour sa sollicitude pour notre horaire.
I would like to thank Mr. Ernwine. I'd like to reassure him that the UQAM team will come to defend their study, and I'd like to listen to the debate because they've come up with a study, and Mr. Ernwine came up with affirmations. I'd like to confront the two.
To Mr. Pichetti, please.
Merci, Mr. President. Madame Bergevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Bergevin, you indicated that you say that since information was available by Swiss banks, you've seen the cases increase. What I said was that there were 26 audits on the Liechtenstein accounts as of April, and I gave you an up-to-date figure of 30. So 26 cases as of April, and from April to October there were only 4 additional cases? Are you satisfied with the number of cases that have been opened during that time? I know things take a long time. But in terms of your satisfaction level, I mean, 4 cases in 6 months, that doesn't seem to be great. Well, in terms of the complexity of the cases and the little information that we have, yes, I'm satisfied with the progress we've made. But aren't all cases that complex? In cases of Swiss or foreign bank accounts, yeah, that's the nature of the beast. These are very complex cases, but evidently audits take some time under normal circumstances, and these are quite complex circumstances, and so it's normal it takes longer. Are we dealing with individual cases or corporate cases? Well, there's a mix. I don't have the percentage, but we can be dealing with foundations, trusts, or individuals. Are we talking about perhaps charitable organization foundations? Well, my suggestion was in terms of an amnesty, wouldn't it be more effective, more timely, and better in terms of output if we simply gave those people an amnesty and asked them for a lump sum payment? I don't know what other countries did. I know in Europe that's a custom. Wouldn't that be an appropriate vehicle? Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd say that each country has to decide and come up with its own policy that is best suited to its own circumstances. In Canada, for quite some time, we've been of the opinion that it was more in Canadians' nature that we apply the law and use resources available to ensure that Canadians who owe taxes pay their fair share. An amnesty that is used in certain countries is perhaps not the right message to be sending. Our colleague, Mr. Szabo, sometimes in the immigration sector, we allow people to come into our country, and perhaps we could do the same thing. We could recover money back into Canada, and I find it quite disappointing that only 4 cases were opened in 6 months, and things aren't finalized yet. And we don't even know what the results will be. Because once you file the notice of assessment, you're not certain to recover the money. Well, we've only been dealing with the aggressive tax planning, and we've recovered, there are 1,850 cases. But imagine how much money could be saved if by simply having the money returned without having any work done. Perhaps we could set a percentage. I'm surprised you haven't conducted analysis or have done any studies on that. I don't understand. Because as years go by, people know that they have to pay taxes, but there doesn't appear to be a desire to repatriate the money.
Yeah, hopefully it's responsive, and to add to my colleague's own comments. The idea of an amnesty is not a patently unreasonable one. No one, I think, is suggesting that. But there are sort of incentives that it incorporates, which I think would give us pause. I mean, functionally, it's a reward for non-compliance. If by virtue of not paying your tax, you're forgiven interest and penalties, and perhaps for paying a fraction of the tax, that's better, excuse me, financially, than if you'd paid your tax all along. There's also the issue about that there's going to be an expectation of repetition. If one amnesty is declared, what are the odds perhaps that it's going to be declared again sometime in the future? That can be an incentive to evading tax to try to get in on the next one. So it's a balancing act.
I understand all that, and that's why I was saying there should be a study done on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Paet.
Mr. Paet, please. Yes. I would like to come back to Mr. Ernwine's statement earlier with regard to the information that we do not have on, for instance, financial institutions or banks. I'm quite surprised to hear that, because every year the Bank Act, which is under the Minister of Finance, requires banks to produce an annual report. Some banks have already published their annual reports. And we have them all since October 31st, 2009. I imagine the agency and the Department of Finance has all of that information. So I'm curious as to why we don't know how much. For instance, the Scotia Bank, on page 133 of its annual report, indicated that there were 10 tax havens and that it was able to save $325 million in unpaid taxes in Canada. RBC, on page 128 of its annual report, indicates that they have 28 branches in tax havens, and they're saving $360 million in taxes in Canada. We're not talking about income here. We're talking about taxes owed. TD, in 4 branches, and on page 129, says they have $450 million in 4 branches. As for CIBC, on page 150 of their annual report, say they have 12 branches in tax havens, representing $118 million. They don't seem to be quite effective there. As to the Bank of Montreal, on page 152 of their annual report, they say they have 3 branches in tax havens for $212 million. And finally, the National Bank, on page 144 of its annual report, indicates that with branches in 2 tax havens, it saves $45 million. We're talking about 59 countries here, including 9 on the gray list, 11 that have agreements signed with Canada but that are not in effect, and 14 with which there are no agreements signed but negotiations are underway. And in 2009, $1.5 billion in unpaid taxes. I'm surprised you don't have information about that. The Department of Finance does not know that there's $1.5 billion in money available every year. And I bet my shirt, perhaps you don't want it, but I bet my shirt that as of October 31st, 2010, things will be even worse. So to sign an amnesty would be losing our collective memory and just forgetting things. How come we have that information and you don't go and get it? You pretend you don't have it.
The opportunity to come back to this because I think it's an important point. First of all, I don't believe I said, but if I'd given the impression that I thought we didn't have information relating to our own banks, I didn't mean to say that. I don't believe that's true. I think the honourable member has demonstrated that indeed we do have the information in relation to Canadian banks. My point earlier was that we don't have information in relation to tax evasion, which might, for instance, mean that we don't have information about what foreign banks hold by way of investments from Canadians. But I don't believe that's true in relation to Canadian banks. I think as their own reports put forward, we do have that. Point 2, I don't think this is a matter of tax evasion. I think this is a matter of our Canadian banks having operations in Canada and outside of Canada, and in relation to their investments and operations outside of Canada, they don't pay current Canadian tax when those operations are subsidiarized. That is the same set of rules that I think applies in every country in the world. As far as I'm aware, there was only one country that ever sought to tax the business income of foreign subsidiaries, and it stopped doing that. No one else does. Our system is very much like that. So I think the characterization of that as tax avoided or perhaps even evaded is wrong. It's actually tax. It's actually income earned in a foreign jurisdiction and subject to the tax laws we impose in respect of that jurisdiction.
My understanding is that this isn't tax avoidance. Well, that's a good thing, but we're talking about a conservative government tax policy which states that we know that there's $1.5 billion in unpaid tax money that could be recovered in those tax havens, and we're not going and getting that money. That's what you're saying. It's a policy by the Conservative government saying we know the money's there and corporations are entitled to do so.
1938, so it does predate this government. But the main point is that I don't believe it is tax avoided. I think it's tax. It's the application of Canadian laws to say that foreign companies owned by Canadians won't be taxable in Canada simply because of having Canadian shareholders.
Okay, thank you. Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on a couple of questions that have been raised, if I heard correctly, Mr. Pichetti and the Liberals were suggesting that a tax amnesty might be a good idea or something to consider. Would that not basically reward tax dodgers and create an incentive for people to hide as long as possible, knowing that the longer they hide, the more they could save?
Well, that's what I suggested earlier as a concern. I mean, there are considerations going the other way that you can try to bring people back into the system, and that's helpful too. But certainly one of the objections or concerns with having an amnesty is that, yes, it would reward the non-compliant and perhaps provide an incentive for repetitive behavior.
Now, I also understand that the NDB has said that the U.S. compiles an amount as to how much money is lost to tax havens. Mr. Layton made the following statement, quote, "I'm calling on Mr. Harper to begin publishing annual estimates of the tax dollars that Canadians are losing to wealthy tax cheats in some corporations. Les États-Unis le font maintenant.
U.S. do so now. 100 billion in unpaid taxes and tax havens a year. That's an enormous void to fill for taxpayers."
That estimate comes from the U.S. IRS. Would that not be a good source for that information?
Actually, the suggestion was made that it comes from U.S. Treasury, but I don't know and so can't confirm that.
Do you think there's any benefit to your department taking the time to try and figure out what the estimate would be, or would that be a waste of time?
I don't want to characterize it as a waste of time, but I think it would be a very difficult exercise, and the number of assumptions one would have to make to arrive at a number would make the exercise perhaps of less utility than you would hope.
It would seem to me that the department might better spend its time, actually trying to find the tax dodgers and creating estimates of them. Mm-hmm. Now, earlier in your presentation, you also said that you had some additional rules that you could expand on, given the opportunity. Well, I'm here to give you that opportunity.
Thank you. I'll just take a moment to elaborate a little bit on what we have in the international context. There are obviously others that apply domestically, but there have been foreign reporting rules that have been placed for a number of years, and these are not declarations, as I said earlier, of income, but rather declarations, simple declarations of the existence of foreign assets, which can be used as an indicator for the Canada Revenue Agency as to whether to conduct further investigations to determine if all income associated with those assets are being reported. We also have rules in place dealing with investments in so-called foreign investment entities, offshore mutual funds and the like, that are in respect of which a tax is payable if the investment was tax motivated. There are proposals pending. There were some modifications to these in the 2010 budget to tighten our non-resident trust regime to try to ensure that people don't not evade, because these are people who are seeking to be compliant with the law, but that in terms of making investments in non-resident trusts, that a fair amount of tax is paid even when investing in outside of Canada through a non-resident trust. And finally, in the 2010 budget, we have a proposal to institute new reporting obligations for those who participate in aggressive tax transactions. If the transactions with which they're involved and have some confidentiality agreement with the advisor or the promoter, or there's a fee associated with it, which is based on the tax plan working or not, or being successful or not, or if there's any sort of insurance or coverage in case the thing fails, those criteria, together with having a tax avoidance transaction in the first place, will impose a positive reporting obligation on the taxpayer, and in some cases on their advisor or promoter to declare the transaction to CRA, and again for CRA to be able to have the leg up, if you will, to investigate further.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hebert. We'll go to Mr. Szabo, please.
Yeah, I'd like to pursue the future strategies, because I think it's really important that we come out of this meeting with a little bit of dialogue. penalties for evasion of income tax fines range from between 50 and 200% interest. Pretty awesome, and I spent a lot of years as a chartered accountant doing tax returns, and I must admit I have had involvement in some cases where people had said, I ran into some difficulty, I couldn't pay my taxes, and by the time I got recovered, I had so much accumulated that I couldn't possibly afford to pay it back. And so I had no way out, so I was just playing roulette trying to figure out whether I could continue to go on without getting that phone call. And once you get the phone call, the next thing you do is you probably go get a rope and hang yourself. I mean, there really are some, very clear stories about how it happens. And I know that finance and CRA know very much how people get into trouble. A voluntary disclosure program is an amnesty, isn't it? Of sorts. You can come out and you can negotiate a deal, and you don't have to pay 200% interest. You can say, let's do the best I can, and I want to pay, as much as I can, but I also have to survive and live. And it effectively is an amnesty program. And so what I wanted to ask you then is, let's not call it an amnesty. We have a program already that allows people who with good faith wants to come out and make it right the best that they possibly can over the long term. I'd rather have 80% of something than 100% of nothing. And that's got to be part of our strategy, I hope. So my questions to you is that if we're now embarking on new initiatives for international treaties and information sharing and really digging our heels in on those who are using offshore instruments, isn't it time that we told Canadians how we feel about this and have a public education program that goes out with it rather than just the big stick?
Forgive me, Chairman. How we feel about an amnesty, or how we feel about voluntary disclosure?
As I said, the voluntary disclosure program is effectively an amnesty, because you're not going to be paying. You can negotiate down, and we're going to figure out, just like Mr. Mulroney did. It says, here's what it got, and it was just a very fraction of what he otherwise owed if he had declared it in the first place. But you have a tool there already, and it's not being subject to the penalties, and interest and all this other stuff. It's just, let's make a settlement. It seems to me that it would cost a lot less if you didn't have to go into court cases and all of the months and months of research of data when people would be prepared to come forward. If we only told them about it, I think that the Canadian taxpayers out there are just afraid. They're afraid to come forward under the voluntary program, okay? And we haven't told them that you don't have to be afraid because, quite frankly, it's a win-win if we can get you on the tax rolls fairly and you're paying your taxes. So what's the thinking here? Are we just going to use a big stick? Are we going to say, everybody, come on, take a chance here. We have a program. You can come out, and I want you to get back on the rolls because the stress is going to kill you a lot sooner than your natural other health problems.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to clarify one thing. I would hate for the honourable members to leave here today thinking that you can negotiate a deal with the voluntary disclosure program. The voluntary disclosure program is a program that allows people to come forward and declare the income that perhaps they didn't declare at first. They do not negotiate a settlement. You have to, one of the conditions to be part of the program is it has to be voluntary, and you have to come forward and state all the income or assets that you have not declared. So therefore, it's not an opportunity to negotiate what your tax debt could be. However, the CRA, not just for international, but for any type of collections or amounts that are due, has a fairness program in place where we can listen if there are cases where the debt has arisen under certain circumstances. We're certainly interested in having a dialogue with the taxpayer to ensure that they comply. Our ultimate, as Madame Michal pointed out at the very beginning, our ultimate goal is to achieve compliance. And if that means in cases where taxpayers owe us a certain amount, if we can negotiate a payment scheme with them, we do that on a daily basis.
And I agree. And I know it works But I also know in my experience that there's a lot of people out there, they're just afraid to give it a chance.
Okay, thank you. I just have a few questions here. I wanted to clarify with CRA a couple of issues, and you may have answered it already. But with regard to the $1 billion in 2009 that you uncovered with respect to unpaid taxes involving international activities, can you tell me how much was from assets in an offshore bank account that was owned by an individual? Would you have that information?
We don't have it
Can you get that for me?
divided in segment of taxpayers. We'll look at what we.
Okay.
I can't guarantee that we can segregate to that level.
Okay, any information you can on that would be helpful. The second question would be, you identified the auditing of 6,700 cases. You may have answered this already, but how many cases were there problems with of the 6,700 that were audited since 2006?
How many were?
So it says since 2006, the CRA has audited more than 6,700 cases.
Yes.
So how many cases were there problems with?
Well, I said that we have audited and completed that amount of cases, and this is we have uncovered 3.7 billion tax dollars. So
okay, I'm just ballpark. I mean, is there a problem with 50%, 20% of the cases that you audited?
how many reassessed? Do you know that? Do we have that?
I don't have this information with me. I guess your question is how many of those 6,700 cases are reassessed? Have an amount reassessed?
Okay, well, if you can get that to me, I'd appreciate that as well. I did want to return to the issue of banks in other jurisdictions with you, Mr. Irwine, and I've got about 2.5 minutes left, because if you look at it, I mean, take the example of BMO. BMO owns Harris Bank in the United States. I mean, so they obviously pay taxes in the U.S., but they're not avoiding tax in Canada. In fact, a Canadian bank owns a bank that operates in the U.S. and therefore complies with U.S. laws with respect to tax and other matters. So, in fact, that, in my view, is actually a good thing for Canada and a good thing for Canadians in the sense of our companies actually owning companies in other jurisdictions is a good thing. We want to have, obviously, as much investment in Canada as possible, but we want our companies to be global champions as well. But I think some people may think, they may think that's somehow avoiding tax when it's not. So I did want to give you an opportunity, a couple minutes here, to really clarify the activities of our banks and insurance companies and others in other jurisdictions and the issue of tax avoidance, because I think that does really need to be clarified.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to return to this. Yes, I think the example you give of a Canadian bank owning a U.S. financial institution is an excellent one. U.S. tax rates are at or are increasingly above Canadian tax rates, and that may mean that the amount of tax paid in the United States on the U.S. bank's income is actually greater than the Canadian tax bill. We provide a foreign tax credit. That is, we allow a deduction for foreign taxes against Canadian taxes paid. So in those circumstances, the profits of the U.S. financial institution owned by the Canadian parent bank would produce no additional Canadian tax, and that seems reasonable because you need to provide the foreign tax credit to eliminate double taxation. That's one case. Another case is where a financial institution owned by a Canadian bank, a subsidiary, is located in a jurisdiction that has a lower tax rate than Canada. And in those circumstances, we don't impose current tax on that foreign subsidiary's business profits, just as I said, every other country or almost every other country does as well. That is, does not tax that income. And that leads me to my third point, which is that the suggestion that we can look at these foreign financial institutions owned by Canadian banks or other financial institutions and simply apply a Canadian tax rate to it, I think is misleading at best, because it suggests that if we went and imposed a 25% tax on these profits, that the Canadian bank would still get the business. Every other bank in the world having operations in that same location is subject to the same non-taxation rules, and that's why we don't tax also for competitiveness reasons. And so applying a fictional tax rate or applying a tax rate to this fictional income would, I think, be a misleading way to measure Canadian revenue losses.
Okay. Well, I very much appreciate that clarification. I want to thank you all for being with us here this afternoon, for responding to our questions. If there's anything further you wish the committee to consider, please do submit it to the clerk. We will ensure all members get it. Thank you so much.